Years ago, a man who had once been part of the elite Delta Force had given up the intense, high-stakes world of military operations. Now he lived a quieter life in a small town, far from the chaos of his past. His home was modest, tucked away on a quiet street, and he kept mostly to himself. But his days were not empty. They were filled with the company of his dog, a loyal German shepherd who had been by his side throughout his military service. The dog wasn't just a pet, it was a part of him, a companion who understood him in ways that no human could. They shared a bond forged in the most difficult of circumstances, a bond that had helped them both survive years of conflict. Life had slowed down for him. He spent his mornings taking long walks with the dog through the neighborhood, letting the quiet of the early hours soothe him. Sometimes they would stop at the small park near his house. It was a peaceful place, the kind of park where people came to relax, walk their own dogs, or just enjoy the outdoors. It was there on one of these morning walks that everything changed. On that particular day, the park was mostly empty. The man and his dog enjoyed their usual routine, walking along the winding paths, the dog trotting alongside him, ears perked, ever watchful. The man could feel the weight of his past life, the quiet hum of memories, but for the most part he was content. The simple pleasures of life now meant more to him than anything else. As they turned a corner, the man noticed a few figures in the distance, local law enforcement officers, walking their beat as part of a routine patrol. He didn't think much of it. It was a small town, and the officers were just doing their jobs. The dog, however, was always alert, instinctively wary of strangers. The man had learned long ago to trust his dog's judgment. The officers, too, noticed the man and his dog approaching. They had seen him around town, and although they had no idea about his past, he was known as a quiet, solitary figure. They didn't recognize the dog immediately, but they saw its large frame and the way it walked confidently at the man's side. The dog's posture was tense, alert, ready to protect its owner at a moment's notice. It wasn't unusual for a dog to act like this, especially in unfamiliar situations, but the officers misinterpreted it. In their minds, the dog's posture was a potential threat. They didn't know that the dog was well-trained, not in a threatening way, but in a protective way. They didn't know that the man with the dog had once been a soldier, trained to deal with far more dangerous situations than a simple walk in the park. They didn't know how deeply the man trusted his dog, or how long they had been together. Without warning, one of the officers, perhaps out of caution or fear, reached for his weapon. The sound of the safety clicking off echoed through the quiet park, and the dog reacted immediately. It growled, a low rumbling sound that signaled its readiness to defend its owner. The man froze, but before he could say anything or call the dog off, the officer, in a split-second decision, fired. The sound of the gunshot cut through the air like a knife. The dog yelped, a painful, startled cry that shook the man to his core. Time seemed to stop as the dog collapsed to the ground. The man rushed to his side, his heart pounding, a cold rush of panic coursing through his veins. The officer's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, realizing too late what he had just done. "What the hell?" the officer muttered under his breath, his hand still gripping the gun. The other officers, now aware of what had happened, stood in stunned silence. The man knelt beside his dog, cradling its head in his lap, his own eyes stinging with tears that he couldn't hold back. The dog, breathing shallowly, looked up at him, its eyes full of pain and confusion. "It had been a mistake, a tragic, unforgivable mistake. I didn't mean to," the officer stammered, his voice shaky with guilt. But the words felt hollow to the man. They didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the dog, his faithful companion who had been taken from him in an instant. For a moment, the world felt like it was closing in on him. The years of quiet had been shattered by one foolish mistake. But it wasn't just the loss of the dog that hurt. It was the realization that the officers hadn't known who they were dealing with. They didn't understand the connection he had with the dog, or the sacrifices that had been made. They didn't know the man's past, and now it didn't seem to matter to them. It was just a dog, just a pet. The officers offered their apologies, but it was clear to the man that they didn't fully grasp the weight of what had happened. They didn't understand that this wasn't just a pet. It was a piece of his past, a part of the man's life that no one would ever truly understand. As the officers left, the man stayed in the park, holding his dog until the life slowly drained from its body. The grief was overwhelming, but so too was a deep, searing anger. He had known that people didn't always understand veterans, didn't always appreciate the bonds that formed in war. But this was different. This was personal. This was something that could never be undone. As he sat there, his thoughts began to race. He had always kept his past hidden from the world, his true identity buried beneath years of quiet civilian life. But now, as the silence of the park pressed in around him, he realized that things would never be the same. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let the ignorance of these officers define how they treated veterans and their animals. He had to make sure they understood what they had taken from him, even if it meant revealing things about himself that he had tried so hard to keep buried. The loss of his dog was more than just a tragic event. It was the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront not just the law enforcement officers who had wronged him, but the world he had left behind. The quiet life he had built was shattered, and with it, the calm he had worked so hard to create. There was more to this than just a mistake. There was justice to be served. Here's part 2 of the story, written in a simple and engaging style while keeping the tone natural and human-centric. After that fateful day in the park, the man found himself in a state of numbness, as if his emotions had been drained away, leaving only an empty void. The pain of losing his dog was one thing, but the anger and frustration simmered beneath the surface, threatening to explode at any moment. He had known it wouldn't be easy to heal from this, but he hadn't expected the feelings of isolation to hit him so quickly. It wasn't just that his dog had been taken from him. It was the fact that the officers didn't seem to understand the gravity of what they had done. The days following the incident felt like a blur. The man went through the motions of daily life, but there was no joy, no comfort. He avoided his usual walks as the empty leash around his wrist was a painful reminder of the bond he had lost. The world outside seemed indifferent to his grief, and that indifference stung more than anything else. When the man tried to reach out to the police department, he was met with impersonal responses and vague assurances that they would look into the matter. He spoke to the officers who had been involved in the incident, but their apologies felt hollow. They had no idea who he was, what he had been through, or the depth of the connection he had shared with his dog. They were just local officers doing their job, but they hadn't understood the weight of their actions. And that lack of understanding was what tore him apart. Weeks passed, and the man became more determined. He couldn't just sit back and let this injustice slide. The loss of his dog had exposed something deeper, something that went beyond his personal grief. It was the way people treated veterans and their animals. The way they didn't understand the sacrifices that had been made, the loyalty that ran deeper than any civilian could comprehend. One evening, as he sat in his small living room, staring at the framed photos of his past missions, photos that he had kept hidden away for years, he made a decision. He couldn't let his dog's death be in vain. He had to take action, even if it meant confronting the very people who had no idea who they were dealing with. He knew the police officers had acted out of ignorance, but ignorance couldn't be allowed to excuse the consequences of their actions. The man began to think about his next steps. He knew that revealing his identity as a former Delta Force operator would have consequences. It would change everything, but at the same time, he understood that it was the only way to force them to truly understand what had happened. He wasn't just some regular civilian. He had been part of an elite military force, trained in ways that most people could never imagine. And his dog had been more than just a companion. It had been his partner, his protector. With a sense of purpose, the man reached out to some of his old contacts from the military. He had kept his relationships with his former colleagues casual, never wanting to draw attention to himself. But now he needed help. He needed advice, and perhaps he needed the weight of his past to bring attention to his cause. One of his old friends, a fellow veteran, listened to his story and understood immediately. "You know what you're doing, right?" his friend asked. "This isn't just about the dog anymore. This is about sending a message." The man nodded. He had already realized that this wasn't just about seeking justice for his pet. It was about raising awareness of the challenges veterans faced when trying to live normal lives after their service. It was about showing the world that just because a person had left the battlefield, it didn't mean that the war was over. His friend agreed to help, offering to put him in touch with a lawyer who specialized in cases involving law enforcement misconduct. The man had never imagined he would be in a position like this, fighting not only for the life of his dog, but for recognition of the trauma veterans experienced when returning to civilian life. It was one thing to face the horrors of war, but another entirely to be misunderstood and overlooked once it was over. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. The lawyer was helpful, but the man could sense that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. He had to prove that the officer's actions were not only wrong, but that their failure to recognize his identity had compounded the mistake. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. It wasn't just about the lack of training within the police force. It was about how society treated veterans as if their experiences and sacrifices didn't matter once they hung up their uniforms. Meanwhile, the man continued to struggle with the decision to reveal his past. For years, he had worked hard to keep his military life separate from his civilian one. He didn't want to be defined by his service, didn't want people to see him as just a soldier, but now he realized that it was the only way forward. To gain justice, he had to let the world see who he truly was. One evening, while he was alone in his house, sitting by the window, he made the call. He called the police department and requested a meeting with the chief. The man wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve. Perhaps an apology, perhaps a promise that something would be done. But deep down he knew that this wasn't going to be resolved easily. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he had to take this step. When the meeting was scheduled, he prepared himself for what was to come. He dressed carefully, choosing his clothes not to blend in, but to stand out. He knew that his appearance would matter. He wanted the officers to understand that this was not just a random citizen confronting them. He was someone who had lived a life few could ever understand, someone whose experience held weight. The meeting took place in a small, sterile conference room in the police station. The chief of police sat across from him, along with a few other officers who looked uncertain about what was about to unfold. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He began by explaining the loss of his dog, the grief he felt, and how the officers had reacted. He told them about the bond he shared with his dog, and how that connection went beyond just being a pet. Then, with a calm but firm voice, he revealed his past. "You don't know who I am," he said, watching their faces change as they listened. "I wasn't always just another civilian. I was part of something bigger. I served in Delta Force." For a moment there was silence. The officers stared at him, unsure how to respond. The chief blinked, clearly taken aback. "Delta Force?" he repeated, his voice dropping slightly. "You mean you were—" "I was an operator," the man interrupted. "I served my country. I fought in some of the most dangerous places in the world. And that dog, that German Shepherd you killed, was my partner. He was more than just a pet to me. He saved my life more times than I can count." The room was heavy with tension now. The chief opened his mouth to speak, but the man continued, his voice unwavering. "Your officers didn't recognize me. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that my dog wasn't just any dog. He was trained to protect. He was my partner, and when you killed him, you killed a piece of me too." The silence stretched on. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The man wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe an apology, maybe something more. But what he got instead was the realization that he wasn't going to get the kind of justice he wanted from the system alone. If he wanted to see change, he would have to fight for it. Not just for himself, but for all veterans who had been overlooked and misunderstood. The chief finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were. We'll look into this, of course, and we'll make sure our officers get better training." But the man knew that words weren't enough. He had taken the first step, but the battle was far from over. Here's part 3 of the story, keeping it engaging, simple, and human-centric. The following days felt like a blur, as if the world was moving too quickly and yet not at all. After the meeting with the police chief, the man couldn't help but wonder if it had made any difference. The chief had promised that they would look into the matter, that the officers involved would be held accountable. But he knew how these things worked. Promises were often just words, empty and hollow, meant to smooth things over until the dust settled. The man couldn't afford to let that happen. His anger, though simmering down, was still present, always there beneath the surface. He thought about his dog every day, the dog who had been his partner, who had shared in the most difficult moments of his life. The bond they shared was something that few could understand, but it was everything to him. Losing the dog was like losing a part of himself, a part that could never be replaced. He couldn't let the officers walk away from this without facing the consequences of their actions. But how could he make them truly understand what they had done? They hadn't just killed an animal. They had killed a connection, a relationship built on years of loyalty and trust. His dog had been a shield, a protector. When the officers had fired that shot, they had destroyed something far greater than just a pet. Determined to find justice, the man decided to go public. He had never been one for attention, never wanted to draw the spotlight to himself. But this was different. This was about more than just him. It was about every veteran who had been overlooked, every military service animal that had been treated as nothing more than a tool. He reached out to a local news station, explaining what had happened and how the police had mishandled the situation. At first, they were hesitant to cover the story. After all, it was just a dog, and the officers involved had already apologized. But the man was persistent. He told them that this wasn't just about a dog. It was about the way veterans were treated when they came home. It was about the lack of understanding, the ignorance that led to mistakes like this. It didn't take long before the news station agreed to cover the story. The man wasn't sure what he expected from the media attention. He knew it wouldn't bring his dog back, but maybe, just maybe, it would spark some kind of change. The report aired a few days later. The man watched it from his living room, his heart pounding in his chest as the footage played. The anchor spoke about the incident, about the tragic death of the dog and how the police department had promised to investigate. They showed a few clips of the man, talking about his dog, about the bond they had shared, and about the pain he felt in losing him. He didn't hold back. He spoke from the heart, sharing his grief and his anger in a way that felt raw and unfiltered. After the report aired, the response was immediate. People reached out to him from all over, offering their condolences and expressing their support. Some were veterans themselves. Others were simply animal lovers who understood the pain of losing a pet. But there was one common thread in all the messages. They all understood the depth of the loss. The news story also put pressure on the local police department. The public outcry was swift and the pressure mounted. The chief of police, who had promised an internal investigation, was now forced to take action. The officers who had been involved in the incident were put on administrative leave while the department conducted its review. But the man knew that this wasn't enough. He didn't just want an investigation, he wanted real change. He wanted the police to understand that this wasn't just a random mistake. This was a result of a systemic issue, a lack of training and a disregard for veterans and their service animals. As the days went by, the man found himself becoming more involved in the fight for justice. He started attending town hall meetings, speaking out about the treatment of veterans and service animals. He met with other veterans, some of whom had also experienced mistreatment or misunderstanding when they returned to civilian life. It became clear to him that his case was not an isolated one. There were countless other veterans who had been ignored or brushed aside by the system. Their sacrifices, their experiences, had been minimized by people who didn't understand the toll that war took on a person. One evening, as the man sat at his kitchen table, reading through some of the messages he had received, he felt a new sense of purpose. He knew that this wasn't just about his dog anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about raising awareness and creating change. He couldn't let his dog's death be in vain. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for all the veterans who had been treated like they didn't matter. But as the weeks passed, the man began to feel the weight of the battle on his shoulders. He was constantly in the public eye now, and while the support was overwhelming, it also came with its own set of challenges. People were watching him, waiting for him to slip up or back down. The media coverage had made him a symbol of something bigger, and while that was comforting in some ways, it also made him feel exposed. His quiet life had been shattered, and now he had no choice but to confront the system that had failed him and so many others. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted his dog back. He wanted the officers to understand what they had done. But as time went on, it became clear that the only way to make a real impact was to continue speaking out, continue raising awareness, and continue pushing for change. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the man wanted to walk away, when the weight of the fight seemed too heavy to bear. But then he would remember the look in his dog's eyes, the way the dog had stood by him through every challenge, every danger. That memory was what kept him going. He couldn't let his dog's legacy be forgotten. The police department's investigation dragged on, and as expected, it didn't lead to the kind of resolution the man had hoped for. The officers involved were not fired, nor were they held accountable in any meaningful way. Instead, they were given retraining on how to handle situations involving animals and veterans. The department issued a public statement apologizing for the incident and promising to improve their protocols. But the man knew that these were just empty words. Retraining wouldn't undo the damage that had been done. It wouldn't bring his dog back. As the investigation came to a close, the man was left with a sense of frustration. He had fought so hard, had pushed so many people to confront the reality of the situation, but in the end it felt like little had changed. The police had gone through the motions, but they hadn't truly understood what had happened. They hadn't understood that this wasn't just about a dog. It was about the treatment of veterans and the deep, often unseen struggles they faced when trying to reintegrate into civilian life. But despite the lack of real change, the man found a sense of peace. He had fought the battle in the way that felt right to him, and while he hadn't gotten the justice he had hoped for, he had raised awareness. He had made people think about veterans in a new light, about the sacrifices they had made, and about the bond they shared with their service animals. And that, he realized, was the first step toward real change. The fight wasn't over, but it had changed him. He had learned that even in the face of defeat, there was power in speaking out and demanding justice. And while the pain of losing his dog would never fully go away, he found comfort in knowing that he had honored his dog's memory in the best way he knew how, by fighting for something that mattered. Here is part 4 of the story, written to keep the narrative engaging, human-centric, and with simple, natural language. The man spent the next few weeks in a state of frustration. Though his public fight had garnered attention, he could feel the quiet pushback from the system he was up against. The police department had done enough to pacify the public, but they had not really changed. The officers involved were back on duty, retrained, but there was no real sense of accountability. The man knew the investigation had been nothing more than a formality. They had said the right things, issued the right statements, but deep down he could tell that nothing would be different. Still, he couldn't walk away. The anger that had been simmering in him from the moment the shot rang out in the park hadn't gone away. It had transformed into something more powerful, something that now fueled his determination. He had made a promise to his dog, to himself, that he would keep pushing until the right thing was done. One evening, as he sat alone in his living room, staring at the empty space where his dog used to lay, the phone rang. It was his lawyer. He had been in touch with the department, following up on the case and pushing for accountability, but things hadn't moved forward in a meaningful way. This time the news was different. "There's a chance," the lawyer said, his voice low but serious. "A lawsuit could make this stick." The man listened closely, trying to process the information. A lawsuit would take time, effort, and a lot more of his energy. But it would also force the department to take him seriously, to address the issue beyond just words. He couldn't let it go. His dog deserved more than empty apologies. "I'm in," the man said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Over the next several months, the legal battle began. The man, who had never thought of himself as someone who would bring a lawsuit, now found himself diving headfirst into the world of legal jargon and paperwork. Every document he signed, every court appearance he made, brought a new layer of stress but also a sense of purpose. His resolve grew stronger with every step he took. During this time, he received support from an unexpected place. Other veterans who had faced similar struggles reached out to him, sharing their own stories of miscommunication, mistreatment, and the lack of respect they had faced when transitioning from military life to civilian life. It was eye-opening to realize how many veterans had experienced the same feelings of being unseen, their sacrifices disregarded. His story had become a rallying point for others who had been quietly suffering in the shadows. One afternoon, while preparing for an upcoming court session, the man found a letter in his mailbox. It was from the police department. His heart sank as he opened it, expecting more empty apologies or promises that nothing would happen again. But this letter was different. It was a direct response to the ongoing lawsuit. The department acknowledged their failure to handle the situation appropriately. They admitted that their officers had not been trained adequately when it came to recognizing veterans and their service animals. They even included a promise to implement new policies for dealing with veterans and animals, emphasizing better communication and understanding. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The letter, though a step in the right direction, felt like it came too late. The damage had already been done, and the man knew that this wasn't just about changing policies, it was about holding people accountable for their actions. Despite the acknowledgement, the man didn't feel any relief. The legal battle was far from over, and this letter didn't make the pain of losing his dog go away. It didn't fill the void left behind, but it did confirm one thing: his fight had made a difference. It was clear that the department had been forced to pay attention, even if only to avoid further damage to their reputation. The man wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a force that couldn't be ignored. As the court date approached, the media attention started to pick up again. His story, once a local issue, had now become something much larger. News outlets from across the country were following the case, with many focusing on the broader implications for veterans and how they were treated after returning home. His dog's death had sparked a conversation that went far beyond the small town where it had happened. But with the media coverage came even more scrutiny. The man found himself in the spotlight more than ever before, and it was starting to take its toll. He had never wanted fame. He had never wanted to be the center of attention. His only goal had been justice for his dog, but now he couldn't avoid the fact that he had become a symbol for something much bigger than just one loss. The media coverage, while helpful in raising awareness, also brought with it invasive questions, constant interviews, and the pressure of public opinion. Some people supported him, others criticized him, but in the midst of it all, the man realized something important. He had started this journey for his dog, but now he was fighting for all the other veterans who had been mistreated and misunderstood. His fight had become theirs. The day of the court session arrived, and with it a renewed sense of determination. The man walked into the courthouse with a steady resolve. He wasn't nervous. He was focused. He knew this wouldn't be an easy fight, but he also knew that he had done everything he could to make his case heard. The courtroom was packed with people, some there to support him, others there because they wanted to see how the case would unfold. The officers involved in the shooting were present as well, their faces tense with uncertainty. As the case was presented, the man found himself standing before the judge, recounting the events of that day. He spoke about the bond he had shared with his dog, about how that dog had been more than just an animal to him. He talked about the trust they had built together over the years, about the countless times the dog had protected him, kept him safe. And then he spoke about the moment the officer had fired that shot, about how it felt to watch his dog collapse in front of him. It was a difficult thing to relive, but the man knew that it was necessary. He wasn't just telling his story. He was telling the story of every veteran who had ever felt like they didn't belong, who had ever been misunderstood or disregarded. He was telling the story of all the military service animals who had never been properly recognized for their loyalty and sacrifice. The defense tried to argue that the officers had acted in good faith, that they had been trained to respond to threats. But the man wasn't convinced by their arguments. He knew that the officers had acted out of fear and ignorance. They hadn't understood what his dog meant to him. They hadn't recognized the deep bond that had formed between them, the trust that had been built over years of service. As the trial went on, the pressure continued to mount, but the man held steady, his resolve unwavering. He knew that this wasn't just about winning the case. It was about forcing people to recognize the importance of veterans and their service animals. It was about showing the world that they deserved respect, that their sacrifices mattered. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered the verdict. It wasn't the grand victory the man had hoped for, but it was something. The department was ordered to pay compensation for the loss of his dog, and more importantly, they were required to implement the new policies they had promised in their letter. The officers involved would face a disciplinary review, though they were not fired. It wasn't the kind of justice the man had imagined, but it was something. The fight had been long, and it had come at a personal cost, but in the end he had forced change. He had made sure that his dog's death had not been in vain. As he left the courthouse, the man felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but he had taken the first step. He had honored his dog's memory, and he had made sure that something positive would come from the tragedy. In the end, the man had learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes justice didn't come in the form of a perfect victory. Sometimes it came in the form of raising awareness, pushing for change and standing up for what was right. And sometimes it came simply in knowing that you had done everything you could, no matter the outcome. Here's part 5 of the story, written in a simple, engaging, and human-centric way. The man left the courthouse feeling an odd sense of peace, a calm he hadn't known in months. The battle, though not won in the way he had hoped, had resulted in change. The system had acknowledged the error, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a step forward. But even as he walked away, he couldn't fully shake the feeling that something was still missing. His dog wasn't coming back, and no amount of compensation or policy changes could fill the void that had been left behind. He spent the following days quietly reflecting. The public fight had taken a lot out of him, but he knew it had been necessary. It had given him purpose in the wake of his loss, something to focus on when the grief became too heavy to bear. But now, without the noise of the courtroom and the media, the quiet of his home felt different. The absence of his dog was felt more keenly, the silence louder than ever before. He would never stop missing the companion who had shared so many difficult moments of his life. The man decided to take a break from the spotlight. He declined more interviews and distanced himself from the ongoing media coverage. For the first time in a long while, he needed time for himself, time to grieve, time to heal. It was hard to let go of the anger and the need for justice. He had fought so hard, but in the end, nothing would bring back the dog who had stood by him through thick and thin. He took long walks again, just like he had before, but this time, they were different. He walked alone, without the comforting presence of his dog by his side. The familiar streets, the park where he had spent so many mornings with his dog, all seemed to carry a quiet sadness. He would pass the spot where his dog had been shot and feel a wave of sorrow wash over him, but also a sense of resolve. He knew that his dog's memory would live on, not just in his heart but in the changes that had been made because of the fight. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the weight of his grief began to lighten. The world kept moving forward, and so did he. It wasn't easy, but life had a way of moving even when we didn't feel ready. The man started to find small moments of peace again. He returned to his old routines, taking walks and enjoying the quiet of his small town. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he first left the military, but it was his life now, and he was determined to make the best of it. One day, as he sat on the porch of his home watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was the lawyer again, and this time the call was different. The man's heart skipped a beat as the lawyer spoke. "We've received word from the police department. They're moving forward with the new training programs, and they've implemented new procedures for handling situations with veterans and service animals," the lawyer said. "It's a step in the right direction. It's more than just words. They're taking it seriously." The man listened intently, a small sense of satisfaction creeping in. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was progress. The police department was finally doing what it should have done from the beginning, and that meant something. It meant that his dog's death had not been in vain. The changes that were being made would help others in the future, help ensure that no other veteran had to face what he had faced. The phone call ended, and the man sat there for a long time, taking it all in. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and while it would never bring his dog back, it made him feel that maybe, just maybe, there was some justice in the world. It was small, but it was real. Months passed, and the man continued with his quiet life, now with a renewed sense of purpose. He started volunteering at local veterans organizations, helping other veterans navigate their own struggles with reintegration into civilian life. He used his experience, his story, to raise awareness about the challenges veterans faced when coming home. He spoke about the importance of recognizing and supporting service animals, about the bond that formed between a veteran and their dog. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was meaningful. He found fulfillment in knowing that he was making a difference, however small. He also found himself reconnecting with old friends, people he had lost touch with over the years. They had heard about his fight, and many reached out to offer their support. It was a comfort to know that, even in his darkest moments, there were people who cared, people who understood. One evening, as he sat with a group of fellow veterans sharing stories and laughing at old memories, the man realized that he had come a long way. The pain of losing his dog still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. He had found a way to turn his grief into something positive. He had taken the anger and sadness he felt and used it to bring attention to an important issue. He had made sure that his dog's legacy lived on in a way that mattered. There would always be moments when the grief would resurface. There would always be days when the absence of his dog would hit him like a wave. But those moments became fewer, and they didn't have the same hold on him. He had learned to live with the pain, to honor his dog's memory by continuing to fight for change, even if that meant doing so in quiet, small ways. As time went on, the man found peace. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was enough. He had faced something he never expected to face, and he had come out the other side stronger. He had learned that even in the hardest of times, there was always a way forward. It might not be easy, but it was always there, waiting for you to take that first step. One day, as he walked through the park, he looked at the spot where his dog had been shot. He stopped for a moment, taking in the view, the quiet beauty of the place. He could almost feel the dog's presence beside him, as if it were still there, walking with him. He smiled softly, knowing that the dog was with him in spirit, that the bond they had shared would never truly be broken. The man had learned many things over the past months. He had learned that justice didn't always come in the way you expected, that sometimes you had to fight for it, even when it seemed like an uphill battle. He had learned that the pain of loss could be softened with time, and that it was okay to let go, to heal. Most importantly, he had learned that one person, even in the face of great adversity, could make a difference. The story of his dog, of the fight for justice, wasn't over. It had only just begun, but for now he was at peace. He had done everything he could, and he had done it with honor, with integrity, and that was enough.